A sharp, metallic ring, repeating 5, 6 times, each tone bouncing off the empty walls of the office, folding into the hum of fluorescent lights above. The buzzing overhead was steady, relentless, almost comforting in its constancy, but the ringing cut through it, urgent, demanding attention. She pressed the receiver closer to her ear. "Hello?" Her voice was small, fragile, swallowed almost immediately by the empty room. There was no echo, only silence, the kind that presses in on your ears until your own heartbeat feels loud. She swallowed. The line was dead, yet the ringing continued, somewhere else, somewhere distant. A faint cough, or maybe just the shiver of air conditioning. Her fingers gripped the handset until knuckles whitened. She could hear her own breathing now, shallow, punctuated by small staccato sobs she tried to hide. Each exhale fogged the small glass window beside the desk, but no one was looking. No one ever looked. The call had started as a simple check-in. She'd noticed something out of place, numbers that didn't balance, an address that didn't match the registry, and now she was alone with the ringing, her voice bouncing into nothing. Outside, the city moved on. Distant traffic hummed along avenues she couldn't see, headlights flickering like fireflies in a forgotten night. Somewhere a train clattered over tracks, a lonely sound swallowed by the expanse of buildings. And yet here, in this office, time had stopped. Only the phone existed, and her. Another ring. This one seemed to stretch longer than the last, resonating through her chest. Her hand trembled. She pressed the cradle button, but nothing changed. The ringing had no source now, or perhaps she had imagined it all along. She lowered the receiver and listened. Her pulse was loud, loud enough to echo. A faint scent of coffee lingered in the air, bitter, cold. It clung to the fabric of her sweater. She breathed it in, trying to anchor herself, but it offered no comfort. The smell was a reminder that life outside this moment continued, and inside, only the echo of unanswered pleas. The silence was heavy, so heavy that each tick of the wall clock felt amplified, cruel, as if counting down a time she would never reclaim. She could still hear it, faintly, someone, somewhere, pressing buttons, murmuring instructions she would never hear. She imagined the other end, empty, a dark room, papers scattered, the air thick with dust, and her voice, a thread of panic severed before it could reach anyone. Her fingers traced the edge of the desk, feeling the grain of polished wood, cool under her touch. The phone was heavier now, heavier than any instrument of communication should be. Each ring had drawn more weight into it, until lifting it felt like carrying a stone. She pressed it again to her ear. Silence. Not the absence of sound, but something worse, a vacuum. She thought of all the calls she had answered that day. Calm, methodical, voices she understood, problems she could solve. But this one was different. This one carried the subtle weight of fear she couldn't name, a thread she couldn't untangle, and the line, stubborn and unyielding, offered nothing. A soft click, almost imperceptible, broke the stillness. The line went dead. She stared at the receiver, as if expecting it to speak, to offer some hint of why she had been left on the edge of this small, ordinary abyss. Her lips moved, forming words that dissolved into the thick air of the room. "Hello?" Again, but quieter this time, almost a whisper. The office breathed with her. The humming lights flickered. A window somewhere rattled. The world outside was alive, but inside, only waiting for someone who would never answer. And in that moment, she realized she had become a ghost in the office, a presence witnessed only by the static hum of electricity and the stubborn ticking of the clock. Her desperation, her confusion, her fleeting hope, all trapped in the narrow confines of a silent phone line. She pressed the cradle again. Nothing. Her chest tightened. The room smelled now of old paper and stale air, the kind of smell that lingers in places abandoned too long. She imagined her voice traveling through the wires, across the city, searching for a heartbeat, for someone to say something, anything.
But there was nothing. The line was a tomb. A single ring had become a memory, a phantom echo, a reminder of her isolation. She could no longer remember if she had dialed the number herself or if the phone had called her. The distinction blurred. Panic had given way to a quiet, hollow resignation. And then, silence. Not calm, not peaceful, but complete. The absence of the ringing was louder than the ringing itself. Her hand fell away from the receiver. She rested her forehead on the cool surface of the desk, eyes closing. Somewhere deep inside, she could hear a pulse, her own, and the memory of a voice that had never come. Somewhere beyond the walls, the city whispered on. People walked streets unaware. Cars slipped over asphalt. Trains rattled in the distance. Life continued. But in this room, the world had contracted to a single, terrible point, the unanswered call. She finally let the receiver rest. Its weight felt less like a stone now, and more like a story waiting to be told. The click of the line going dead was the first sentence, the unanswered ring, the futile reaching, the breathless whispers into nothing. All of it mattered. All of it had a witness, if only in the quiet of her own presence. And in that quiet, she pressed the red button again, not to call, not to answer, but to open the file. The cover was cold, the label stamped neatly, File 001, the night shift that stopped answering. She traced the edges with her fingers, hesitant, as if touching it would pull her closer to some truth she could not yet name. The room remained empty, the office lights hummed. Outside, the city continued, indifferent. But now, finally, she was ready to listen. The ring had gone unanswered, but the record had not.
The file waited on the desk. It was small, unremarkable at first glance, but its edges were frayed, the corners softened by decades of handling. Yellowed tape held the seams together, brittle now, splitting at the corners with a faint tear that smelled of dust and time. Its label, once crisp, had faded to a dull brown, letters smudged by hands that had long since disappeared. I traced my fingers along the surface, careful not to disturb its fragile balance. Each touch made the tape groan softly. A hiss of static, like the whisper of a long-forgotten recording, slipped from the folds of paper beneath. The sound was almost imperceptible, but it carried weight. The top of the file bore the official stamp, File 003, sealed March 12, 1987. The ink had faded in uneven patterns, blotchy and fragile. Beneath it, a small handwritten note in cursive that belonged to another time. Do not open without clearance. Evidence incomplete. Some pages missing. I lifted the flap slowly, the crackle of the tape breaking in tiny, anxious bursts. Inside, the papers were stacked in uneven order. Some were torn, edges curled like dead leaves. Others had folded corners, annotations written in pen that had begun to bleed through the paper with age. Marginalia, questions scribbled in haste, symbols that never quite made sense, hinted at the unease of those who first encountered this record. It was immediately clear why this file had been deemed unsettling. Procedural logs interrupted each other, gaps in time noted with meticulous punctuation. Calls that should have been answered were listed as unreturned or simply left blank. Phone records ended mid-line, like someone had snatched the pen away. Notes were made of footsteps in empty halls, echoes that were recorded but never verified. And always, beneath the neat bureaucracy, a persistent silence, a space where human sound should have existed but had not. I inhaled. The smell of aged paper and ink filled the small space between my desk and the file. It was an aroma that reminded me each time of lives partially glimpsed, of events half remembered, of questions that refused to close. My fingers lingered over a page with a corner torn away. The missing text made a ghostly gap, leaving my mind to fill it in, to imagine the voices that had once tried and failed to speak. Every page had its own texture. Some were smooth, brittle with age, others rough, pocked with indentations where pens had pressed too hard.
Tape marks traced the borders of documents, slightly sticky, leaving residue that caught on my fingertips. Tiny flecks of dust drifted upward as I turned a sheet, suspended in a halo of faint light. A faint smear of ink caught my eye. It seemed accidental at first, perhaps the hand that wrote it had trembled, but the smear was deliberate enough to suggest distraction, haste, or fear, perhaps all three. My fingers lingered there, imagining the writer, caught mid-thought, mid-breath, unsure if the words would matter, if anyone would ever read them. I removed a second stack of papers, smaller, stapled together. The staples had rusted through time, leaving tiny brown halos. These were call logs, transcriptions, and annotations. Some entries noted a call that was answered, but the voice on the other end was described only as unrecognizable, distant, imploring. Others were marked "line dead, no trace." There were diagrams too, rough sketches of corridors, doors, and reception areas, hand-drawn maps overlaid with arrows and notes, "No one here, empty office, echo only." Each one evoked the quiet dread of isolation, a systematic documentation of absence. As I handled each page, I became aware of the subtle sounds the file made, a hiss of adhesive tape, the gentle scratching of paper against paper, a faint thump as one document slid against another. These were not intrusive noises, but they drew attention to the meticulous act of reading, of cataloging. The file demanded care, respect. One false move could tear a page, and with it, a fragment of history would vanish. I paused to inspect the cover again. Its edges were curled, the surface mottled, with small smudges from fingerprints long faded. The label bore the neat bureaucratic language of officialdom, but the paper itself told another story, a story of decay, of imperfection, of time pressing against memory. There was a certain rhythm to opening such a file. Each sheet required attention, each annotation a pause, each missing page a space in which imagination, fear, and regret could move freely. I worked methodically, aware that the file was not only a document, but a witness. Its silence spoke as much as the words it contained. A corner of a page fell forward, exposing a faint imprint, perhaps of a document once pressed on top, long removed. It was like seeing the shadow of something lost. I lifted it, holding the paper close to the light. The faint indentation revealed a number, partially legible. Names, perhaps, partially erased. The act of touching it felt intrusive, but necessary. I found a small envelope tucked between two folders. The seal was intact, brittle. I hesitated before breaking it. Inside were photographs, grainy black and white images of rooms, hallways, and empty chairs. Nothing appeared out of place in any individual image, yet together they conveyed a strange emptiness, a series of spaces marked by absence rather than presence. The photographs had been annotated, faint notes in the margin, still unanswered, echo only. I replaced the envelope carefully. The file's secrets were fragile. Each reveal, each moment of inspection demanded patience. The materials themselves seemed to resist rush, to insist that time be given for thought, for reflection. Finally, I set the last page aside. The file, now open, lay before me like a quiet witness to its own history. It was complete, yet incomplete, clear, yet ambiguous, a record of events that had occurred but had never fully spoken, that had been documented but never explained. And in that quiet, I assumed my role as archivist. I was not the first to touch these pages, I would not be the last, but for now, the file was mine to handle, to examine, to bear witness. The smell of ink, the hiss of old tape, the rough edges of paper, all of it carried the weight of human experience, the meticulousness of those who recorded it, the confusion of those who could not answer, the emptiness left behind. I inhaled. The quiet settled around me. Outside the window, the city moved on, indifferent. Inside, the file waited, and I, archivist, prepared to listen. File 003 had been opened.
The city moved in patterns that seemed ordinary, predictable, almost reassuring. It was October 1987. The air carried a chill, damp and faintly metallic, mixing with the scent of car exhaust and the earthy perfume of early fallen leaves. Sidewalks glistened where a morning drizzle had left its mark. People moved with purpose, briefcases swinging, shoes clicking against wet stone. Streetcars rattled over tracks, a rhythm that was almost hypnotic in its regularity. Offices hummed quietly. Typists tapped on mechanical keyboards, the soft ding of carriage returns punctuating the murmur of conversation. Telephones sat on desks, black and angular, coiled cords curling like snakes. In the break room, the faint hiss of a percolator promised warmth, the promise of ritual, coffee before the day began in earnest. Life moved slowly here, yet efficiently. Clerks filed papers in metal cabinets. Secretaries arranged schedules on day planners and Rolodex cards. The city's heartbeat was steady, unremarkable, human. There was a rhythm in the ordinary, the tapping of shoes, the rolling of tires on asphalt, the occasional shout from a street vendor. And within that rhythm, lives unfolded, largely unnoticed. The emergency call system operated with a quiet precision. Phones were connected to switchboards, manned by operators trained to keep conversations efficient, to move from question to question without delay. Each call was cataloged, numbers recorded, names verified. The language was formal, courteous, procedural. Mistakes were rare. Silence was not tolerated. Operators wore headsets with thin, springy wires, voices clipped, calm, professional. They had scripts in front of them, laminated sheets detailing procedures. Each call was logged in ink, in handwritten registers, ensuring accountability. Telephones rang constantly, but each ring had its place, each pause its reason. Outside the offices, the city smelled of routine. Bread baking in corner bakeries, gasoline on the streets, leather and fabric from the coat shops lining the main thoroughfare. A faint tang of coal drifted from older buildings, still heating with ancient furnaces. Life smelled alive, ordinary, mundane. People waited for buses in orderly lines, umbrellas in hand. Streetlights flickered on as dusk approached, casting long shadows. Children's laughter echoed from playgrounds, mingling with the low rumble of delivery trucks navigating narrow streets. Window panes reflected the warm glow of offices as clerks finished late shifts, the smell of ink and paper faintly escaping through the cracks. Within this framework, the emergency system functioned like a hidden organ, vital yet invisible. The telephone network connected offices, residences, hospitals, and dispatch centers. Operators worked behind glass panels, behind the scenes, voices soft but insistent. A single misstep, a missed call, a line left unanswered, could ripple outward. Rarely it did. Most days, the system functioned flawlessly, a silent testament to order. The streets were a symphony of the mundane, boots clacking on wet stone, the muted roar of a bus accelerating from a stop, the distant wail of a siren, usually routine, never alarming. Newspapers rustled in hands on benches. Shopkeepers called greetings to one another across streets. In cafes, cups clinked against saucers as patrons sipped black coffee, reading headlines without noticing the small anomalies around them. Inside offices, the tools of work were tactile and immediate. Typewriters required deliberate keystrokes. Mistakes were corrected with white tape or a careful strike of correction fluid. Ink blotters were common. Papers absorbed each line, each mark, carrying the faint impression of a person's hand. Files were stacked neatly, organized by date and subject, their covers labeled, taped, annotated.
This was a world of order, method, and predictability. And yet, within this ordinary rhythm, the possibility of disruption was present, though not noticed. The phones rang as expected, operators answered, people waited their turn. The system was designed to absorb shocks, to manage emergencies with a calm precision, but it was still human, still fragile, still dependent on the attentiveness of those at the controls. The city at that time had no instant messaging, no automated alerts, no constant digital feedback. A misdialed number, a dropped call, a line that went dead, these were more than inconveniences. They were small fissures in the fabric of daily life, capable of magnifying unnoticed, spreading quiet anxiety in their wake. Morning light spilled across polished desks, windows opened to capture the scent of rain-soaked streets. Telegraph wires hummed faintly overhead, a subtle reminder that communication was always in motion, even when invisible. Clerks filed reports, operators answered questions, and the hum of electricity underlined the pulse of the city. By mid-afternoon, the streets had settled into a slower pace. Deliveries had been made, lunch had passed. Typists rubbed tired eyes and sipped water from glass bottles. Telephones continued to ring at measured intervals. The city exhaled quietly, unaware that one small disruption could ripple beyond the hum of routine. For all its calm, for all its ordinary bustle, the city carried shadows, not sinister ones, not yet, merely the possibility of absence, the notion that a call might not be answered, a report might go missing, a footstep might echo in an empty hallway and be recorded nowhere. These were not disasters yet, they were faint echoes, almost imperceptible, waiting. As night approached, streetlights cast long, tremulous beams over wet pavement. Office windows glowed warmly, but inside, fewer clerks remained. The hum of fluorescent lights was steadier, more insistent. Phones rested in their cradles, lines silent for a moment before the next ring. Somewhere in the city, an operator exhaled, unaware that a sequence of unanswered calls would soon become something remarkable. In this city, in this year, life had a comforting cadence. People trusted the system to respond, to record, to notice. Phones connected offices, operators listened, citizens relied. And yet, all of that normalcy, so complete, so grounded, so mundane, was about to be fractured by a single line, a single unanswered call, a single anomaly. The calm, grounded rhythm of the city was a stage, and the file that had been sealed in 1987 held the first evidence that the ordinary could unravel, quietly, methodically, and without immediate recognition. The city smelled like routine, the streets sounded like routine, and the offices, the phones, the operators, and the people all moved through a day that seemed ordinary. Yet, within that ordinary day, in that ordinary city, the extraordinary quietly waited to be discovered.
It began quietly. No alarms, no sudden disruptions, just small things that, in hindsight, carried weight. A phone left ringing longer than usual, its echo fading into the hum of fluorescent lights. A note slipped under a door that no one saw immediately. A message written hastily on a scrap of paper, abandoned on a desk, corners curling with age. At first, no one thought much of these things. Everyone assumed human error, the ordinary flurry of office life. Yet in retrospect, these moments marked the first cracks, the fissures in what had seemed an otherwise unshakable routine. Staff arrived for morning shifts, coffee in hand, coats still damp from drizzle outside. They greeted one another with the habitual nods, murmurs of weather, brief inquiries about health. The sound of shoes on polished floors, the faint scrape of chairs pulled from desks,
the shuffle of papers, all composed the background hum of a city office. And then came the first oddity. A clerk noticed a phone had been left off the hook. The line was dead, yet the dial tone had not returned. A small interruption, barely remarked upon. She lifted the receiver and listened. Silence. Nothing unusual, perhaps, until she tried to log the call, only to find the previous message erased, ink smudged, indecipherable. She frowned, shrugged, and returned the receiver to its cradle. The day progressed. Documents were filed, letters typed, schedules arranged, yet subtle inconsistencies began to emerge. A log sheet that should have listed 3 incoming calls only recorded 2. A message slipped between pages, never delivered. The receptionist noted a colleague arriving late without explanation, unusual for someone otherwise punctual. These events were minor, easily dismissed, but they accumulated, a quiet erosion of certainty. Footsteps echoed differently across hallways now, where once the pattern had been predictable, a measured cadence of human presence. There were gaps, brief silences, unexpected pauses. Someone would approach a desk, glance at the clock, and hesitate, unsure why the line had rung unanswered. A faint whisper of unease began to settle in the office air. Not fear, not yet, just the creeping sense that something was slightly off. The hum of fluorescent lights seemed sharper in the ears, the rustle of papers heavier. The ordinary rhythm had begun to falter. There were coincidences, too. Quiet, subtle, easily ignored. A call misrouted, connecting one desk to another when it shouldn't have. A message left for an absent operator, only to remain uncollected until hours later. A delayed response from a colleague who had once been punctual without exception. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to make people pause, to raise a brow, to mutter under their breath. Lunch hour came, and the office smelled of coffee and sandwiches. Conversations were brief, clipped, tinged with a faint tension no one could fully articulate. Someone mentioned a misfiled report, another noted a line left unanswered. They laughed softly, not to dismiss the worry, but to keep it from settling too deeply. Humor was a shield, however thin. By mid-afternoon, the anomalies had become harder to ignore. A typist glanced up from her work. Her fingers hovered over the keys, a pang of confusion settling. A phone had rung in the corner, unanswered. The operator assigned to it had stepped away. The log sheet, when checked, revealed 2 calls had been crossed, one noted as answered, the other missing entirely. She tapped a pen against the blotter, a rhythmic, impatient sound. The receptionist noticed the same detail a few minutes later. She whispered it to a colleague, who frowned. They exchanged no more than a brief nod. No one spoke it aloud. The unease was delicate, unformed, fragile. It was the sensation of something slipping beneath the surface, moving quietly, almost politely, yet persistent. Somewhere in the office, a drawer was left slightly ajar. Papers shifted when a breeze from a cracked window stirred the air. The sound was soft, a mere shuffle, but it lingered in the mind, like a question unanswered. Another file, resting on a cart, had fallen to the floor, spilling documents in a quiet, unordered heap. No one had dropped it. No one claimed responsibility. Even the phones seemed different now. Their rings carried a hesitation, a fraction of uncertainty. The operators, trained to respond automatically, paused more often. Eyes flicked toward lines, then away, hesitant. The rhythm had shifted, and everyone felt it, though no one could name it. And yet, the office carried on. Tasks were completed, schedules were followed, reports were typed, stamped, filed. To an outsider, the day might have appeared ordinary, routine, undisturbed, but the emotional texture within the walls had changed. The office felt smaller, tighter, pressured by an invisible hand that moved through the corridors, touching each person lightly but persistently, leaving them aware of something they could not define. People began to notice small patterns, missed calls clustered around certain desks, lines that had always functioned perfectly now delivered echoes instead of voices. Messages that had once been read immediately lingered in piles. Brief, almost imperceptible coincidences repeated in a rhythm that was wrong, yet not alarming enough to warrant immediate concern. Some glanced toward each other, seeking acknowledgement. A nod, a tilt of the head, a small sigh. The unspoken question hung in the air. Is it just me, or... By late afternoon, the office carried the weight of a subtle vigilance. Every ring, every shuffle of paper, every unexpected pause was noted, cataloged in memory, even when not written. Staff moved through their tasks more deliberately, ears attuned to sounds that had once gone unnoticed. Fingers lingered on the edges of documents, pens poised to capture the faintest anomaly. And beneath it all, a quiet dread began to bloom. Not loud, not obvious, not even fully recognized. It was the sense that something ordinary had begun to fracture, a fissure, barely visible, running through routine and habit. The first cracks. No one could say when the first true disruption would occur. It could be an unanswered call, a misdirected message, a line that went dead. But the office, in those hours, had already begun to feel the strain. The human heart notices things long before the mind does. The small irregularities, the pause, the silence, the faintly odd log were enough to unsettle, to signal that something was quietly, inexorably out of place. By the time the day ended, shadows had lengthened across the desks. Fluorescent lights flickered, creating brief, almost imperceptible gaps in illumination. Phones rested quietly in their cradles. Papers settled into neat stacks once more. The office appeared calm. And yet, beneath the surface, the rhythm had changed. The first cracks had formed. The ordinary had been disturbed, in ways small but profound. Staff left for the night carrying a quiet uncertainty, a sensation they could not name. The city outside moved on. Cars passed, streetlights glimmered on wet asphalt, voices echoed in alleys and corridors. Life continued. But inside the office, within the walls where calls went unanswered, papers shifted unnoticed, and small irregularities began to mount, the quiet unease lingered. Something had changed, and it would not return to the way it had been.
It began shortly after 11. The phones were already ringing in their predictable cadence, a familiar pattern that staff had grown accustomed to over years of routine. But this day would mark the moment the pattern fractured. One line, ordinary in appearance, became the focal point of uncertainty. 11:02 a.m. The first call came through. A woman's voice, urgent, breathless. She spoke quickly, words tumbling over one another, a string of requests and questions. The operator, trained and methodical, repeated the instructions, noting details in the log. Her pen moved across the page, careful, deliberate. The lines seemed stable. Then, abruptly, the voice faltered. Static replaced clarity. A pause. And finally, silence. 11:03 a.m. The operator tried to reconnect, pressing the receiver with firm insistence. The line carried only a faint hiss, like distant water running over rocks. No voice returned. The clerk seated nearby glanced up, noted the pause, and shrugged. Perhaps a technical fault, perhaps just bad reception. No one suspected anything beyond the ordinary at first. 11:05 a.m. Footsteps echoed down the hall. The typist looked up from her machine, the rhythmic clatter of keys momentarily ceasing in her awareness. Another phone rang, distant, muted by the thick carpeting and walls. The receptionist leaned forward to answer, but the line was misrouted, connecting her instead to a colleague who was not at her desk. The phone clicked quietly, as if sighing, unacknowledged. 11:07 a.m. The original line remained silent. Another operator picked up a secondary receiver, hoping to triangulate the call, but records were missing. A blank space in the log, a faintly smudged number, a handwritten annotation that read only, "Line dead, no trace." Eyes met across the room. No one spoke. The silence between them grew heavier than any words could have conveyed.
11:10 a.m. A file drawer rattled. Someone had reached for reference material, perhaps seeking clarity, perhaps unconsciously trying to restore order to the faint disarray. The sound drew attention, pulling focus from the phones. Paper shifted, a faint shuffle that seemed louder than it should have been. The operator tapped a pen nervously against the blotter. The sound punctuated the quiet, each tap a heartbeat, marking passing seconds filled with uncertainty. 11:12 a.m. The call attempted again. The voice returned, fragmented. Words that should have carried meaning now barely surfaced, clipped by static. Help, can't, find. And then another silence, broken only by a faint mechanical buzz that suggested the line was live, yet unresponsive. The operator repeated protocol, her voice calm, but with an edge that only she would recognize. Stress had begun to seep in, thin and subtle, threading through her tone. 11:15 a.m. Another call came in from the same extension. The operator reached across the desk for the log sheet, scribbled notes, compared timestamps. Footsteps padded along the corridor outside, muffled but distinctly human. Someone passed, unaware of the tension inside, unaware that the ordinary had begun to falter. The call was dropped mid-sentence, another blank in the record. 11:18 a.m. The typist glanced over. A colleague had begun pacing softly, shifting weight from one foot to another. She noticed the slight tremor in his hands, the way he avoided eye contact with the phone line, the way his breaths came a fraction too fast. It was a human response to uncertainty, a reaction that technical logs could never capture. Anxiety, subtle but growing. 11:20 a.m. The phones rang in clusters. Some were routine inquiries, some misdirected, some seemingly linked to the original call. Each ring pulled attention in different directions, fracturing focus. Operators juggled receivers, fingers flying over log sheets. Muffled voices overlapped faintly, producing a background murmur that was almost comforting in its normalcy, until a line fell silent where it should not have. 11:22 a.m. The operator tried a recorded verification, dialing the extension repeatedly. Each attempt met with static, then silence. The line was open, functional, but utterly unresponsive. The clerk beside her noticed the change in rhythm. The usual cadence of calls had warped. There was no procedure for this exact sequence. No training could account for a line that seemed present and absent simultaneously. 11:25 a.m. A stack of papers slid from the edge of a desk, falling softly. The sound startled no one physically, but the collective awareness in the room shifted. Eyes flicked to the fallen pages, pens paused mid-note, chairs creaked under shifting weight. The office felt denser, heavier, as though the air itself had thickened. 11:28 a.m. A faint click came from one of the phones. The operator lifted the receiver slowly. The line carried nothing but low static. Then, a breath, sharp, panicked, human, but it stopped abruptly. Silence returned. The operator froze, recognizing instinctively that what she was hearing was not mechanical failure. Someone, somewhere, had reached out, and no one had been met with recognition. 11:30 a.m. Muffled voices drifted from the corridor. Someone called a name, no response. A second voice joined in, tentative, cautious. The office seemed to shrink around the operators, the weight of the unanswered calls pressing in, each breath measured, deliberate, conscious of the tension building in the room. 11:32 a.m. Another attempt to connect the original line. The operator pressed the receiver with care. Static hissed faintly, carrying a rhythm almost like speech, almost like a heartbeat. The clerk beside her shivered. No one acknowledged it aloud. The sound persisted, subtle, persistent, as though reminding them that someone had reached out and had not been met with recognition. 11:35 a.m. The phones continued their irregular pattern. Some calls were answered immediately, routine, orderly. Others carried that same weight of anomaly, a missed ring, a delayed connection, a line left untouched. Staff moved with careful deliberation. Typists paused to listen. Operators held their breath, ears attuned to the faintest irregularity. Footsteps were softer now, tentative, mindful of the collective tension. 11:38 a.m. The first sign of panic, not full-blown alarm, but subtle. A clerk left her desk, moving toward the operator's station. Her voice trembled slightly, careful not to draw herself attention. She asked softly, "Did anyone get that last call?" The answer was silence, only the hum of fluorescent lights and the faint rattle of paper. 11:40 a.m. A chair scraped across the floor. Another operator leaned forward, hands gripping the edge of the desk. A pen fell from his fingers, clattering onto the log sheets. His breath hitched slightly. All around, small movements, the shifting of papers, a cough, the tapping of a foot became exaggerated in the tense quiet. The office had become a space of heightened awareness. 11:42 a.m. Phones rang again. A line that had been dead now produced a faint, distant murmur. Someone on the other end spoke, words distorted, unclear. Operators leaned in, straining to catch meaning. The voice fell silent. The line clicked. Nothing followed. 11:45 a.m. The pattern repeated. Call, silence, partial reconnection, static, pause. Staff were alert, wary, responsive, but uncertain. The ordinary rhythm had vanished, replaced by a cadence of unease, an irregularity that seemed deliberate, purposeful in its defiance of expectation. 11:48 a.m. A faint mechanical hum entered the background, possibly from the switchboard, possibly imagined. Logs were checked, compared, cross-referenced, blank spaces remained, pages flipped, notes scrawled in margins, underlines, question marks. The humans in the room were meticulous, alert, anxious. 11:50 a.m. The original call line rang once more. Operators hesitated, sharing a glance. They answered together. Static, faint breathing, an indistinct plea, then nothing. The silence that followed was heavier than any sound they had heard that morning. 11:52 a.m. Footsteps shuffled outside. The corridor was empty. Voices were distant. Papers rustled on desks. Pens clicked. Fingers drummed. But no call returned. No reassurance came. The sense of helplessness settled over the office, subtle but undeniable. 11:55 a.m. Operators began documenting their own uncertainty. Notes became longer, more detailed, yet filled with gaps. Each minute tracked, recorded, yet the truth remained elusive. Silence from the expected responder, conflicting recollections, faint coincidences. The building itself seemed to press inward, magnifying the absence. 11:58 a.m. Phones continued to ring intermittently. Calls came and went, some answered, some not. The office felt suspended, each moment prolonged. The human reactions, anxiety, confusion, cautious pacing, defined the space more than any technical detail. Each breath, each glance, each pause carried weight. 12 p.m. The pattern remained unresolved. No resolution, just repetition. Calls, pauses, static, absence. The office had entered a state of liminality, a threshold where ordinary work and extraordinary uncertainty existed side by side. Staff were aware of it. They moved carefully, eyes alert, hearts conscious of the fragility of routine. By the hour,
It happened in a single moment, though no one recognized it at first. The office had already been permeated by a subtle, creeping unease. Phones rang irregularly. Papers shifted under fingers that no longer typed with complete confidence. Footsteps had become hesitant, punctuated by brief pauses, as though the staff themselves were waiting for the world to speak back. And then, the silence arrived. 11:59 a.m., according to the log, but the time itself is almost irrelevant now. What mattered was the instant when sound ceased where it should not have. A call that had been answered, or so the operator believed, fell abruptly silent. Breath, human and frantic, disappeared into the line. Fingers that had been scribbling notes froze mid-stroke. Chairs scraped against the floor as clerks leaned forward, straining for something that would never return. The first reaction was confusion. No one spoke immediately. The typist's hands hovered over her keys. The operator's eyes flicked toward the switchboard, searching for a signal, a light, a cue, anything that might explain the void. But the line remained dead.
Static hissed faintly, a ghost of communication, and then nothing. The weight of it pressed into the chest of everyone present. A second operator, younger, less experienced, reached out instinctively. Her fingers shook slightly as she lifted the receiver. A faint click, the softest whisper of a breath, but the call did not resume. It was as if the voice had been sucked into the wires and lost somewhere, irretrievably. Panic, subtle at first, began to ripple. Not full-blown chaos, not screaming or hysteria, but an internal, gnawing fear, the kind that makes a person aware of their own fragility. The typist swallowed, a small, dry sound, her heart thumping audibly in the near silence. One staff member approached the desk where the call had originated. Fingers traced the receiver, hesitated, then lifted it again. She pressed the buttons methodically, mechanically, repeating procedures she had executed countless times. Nothing. The line offered only emptiness, a void that no training could pierce. And in that void, human limitation became clear. Minutes stretched, yet no sound returned. The call had begun with urgency, with a plea for help, and ended without recognition. Every protocol that had been designed to catch mistakes, every system built to ensure order, failed in the most devastating way. One life had reached out, and no one, in that precise moment, had been able to answer. Regret began to take shape. Operators cursed softly, almost inaudibly, their own voices small in the weight of the silence. A clerk muttered, thinking no one heard, "I should have checked that line, I should have..." The words trailed off, lost before they could be finished. Everyone in the room carried the same thought, unspoken yet palpable. Perhaps if I had... The caller, the person on the other end, remains only a presence in memory. Their urgency, their breathless confusion, their trembling voice, preserved in incomplete logs, in fragmented recollections. They reached out and were met not with understanding, not with action, but with absence. Hands trembled across desks, pens were dropped, chairs tilted under hurried movements. Someone pressed the switchboard with deliberate force, as though physical pressure might restore what had vanished. Keys clicked in frantic sequences. Papers shifted under anxious fingers. Each sound, each motion carried the weight of desperation. Yet the original need remained unmet. Outside, the corridor was still. Footsteps, once measured and predictable, had become hesitant, echoing faintly and then fading. Voices drifted from other offices, curious and concerned, yet unaware of the full gravity. The world beyond the room continued an ordinary rhythm, ignorance of the failure inside. And the failure was human. Not mechanical, not technological, not simply a line dead or a log missing. The tragedy lay in the ordinary choices, the minor hesitations, the unremarked pauses, the assumptions that someone else would act. Each small omission accumulated into a moment that could not be reversed. It was the quiet calculus of human error, compounded by circumstance, amplified by timing. The consequences unfolded immediately, subtly, tragically. A colleague later recalled a sense of something off in the office air, though at the time she could not have described it. Another remembered the unusual stillness of the phones, the way the hum of fluorescent lights seemed heavier. Each person carried a memory of the moment differently, yet each remembered the same void. The caller's voice, breathless and urgent, exists now only in fragments, a partial sentence here, a muffled word there, interrupted by silence. That silence became permanent, a quiet testimony to what had been lost. There was no screaming, no visible collapse, only the intimate, unbearable weight of helplessness. And within the room, staff processed it in the only ways they could. Some jotted notes obsessively, documenting every irregularity. Others stared at their desks unmoving, listening to the hum of electricity as if it might offer guidance. One operator held the receiver close, letting the silence settle, hoping for a sound that never came. The human cost became clear in moments of reflection. The first was the caller, alone in fear, reaching out for connection and assistance, met instead with absence. The second were the operators, trained to respond, yet unable to meet the demand when it mattered most. And the third, perhaps, was everyone else in that space. Bystanders, colleagues, ordinary people caught within a system momentarily rendered impotent. There was regret, heavy, palpable, inescapable. A feeling that each person could have acted differently, though hindsight revealed the complexity of circumstances. Every hesitation, every assumption, every slight lapse of attention had contributed to a quiet catastrophe. No one screamed, no one fainted. The tragedy was internal, personal, unshared, carried in breaths and heartbeats, in the lingering echo of a voice that never had been met with response. And suddenly, the office was aware of time differently. Seconds expanded into minutes that felt much longer. Every footstep, every shuffled page, every faint ring of a distant phone became charged with meaning. The smallest sound registered as monumental. The air itself seemed heavier, pressing against the shoulders of those present. And then, slowly, methodically, the room returned to its tasks. Phones were monitored, logs were updated, papers were filed. Staff moved with careful precision, performing the routines they had been trained to follow. But nothing restored the original moment. The line remained unanswered, the call remained incomplete, the absence permanent. No one could reverse the moment, no one could fill the silence with sound, the void with action, the fear with reassurance. All that remained were traces, smudged ink on log sheets, faint notes of confusion in margins, the memory of a breathless voice, and the quiet, shared acknowledgement of helplessness. And in that acknowledgement, a somber lesson took root. Systems can fail, protocols can falter, lines can go dead, but the weight of human expectation, the trust placed in another's hands, the reliance on attention, care, and responsiveness cannot be replaced by procedure alone. It lives in the moments when someone reaches out and is met only with absence, when the ordinary turns fragile, and when regret becomes the most tangible companion of all. Hands finally stilled, breaths evened, but hearts remained aware. The office seemed empty, though everyone remained. The hum of electricity, the faint rustle of paper, the distant city noises outside, the world moved on. But within the room, in that carefully catalogued space of routine and protocol, the consequences lingered, quietly, heavily, indelibly. The file would later note the critical failure point, but it could not capture the weight carried by those present. It could not convey the trembling hands, the stilled breaths, the hearts beating too quickly, too loudly in recognition of helplessness. It could only record that a line went unanswered, that procedures were followed as best they could, and that tragedy, small and intimate, had taken its place. The lesson of that day is not in numbers or logs. It is in human experience, in the way a person feels the absence of another, in the lingering ache of missed opportunities, in the quiet, sorrowful acknowledgement that sometimes, despite intention, preparation, and training, one is powerless. And so the file remains, as it always has, a record not only of events, but of lives intersected by misfortune, in the enduring, tragic weight of moments that could never be undone.
The file does not offer answers. It does not provide certainty. Instead, it leaves behind fragments, possibilities, and the persistent echo of what was never resolved. There are several ways to interpret what happened that day. Each theory carries weight, each theory falters, and all are colored by the human experience of doubt and uncertainty. One possibility is miscommunication. Perhaps the operator misheard a word or misrecorded a number. Perhaps the message was delivered to the wrong line, or a call was rerouted incorrectly. In the ordinary course of a busy office, these errors could happen. They are human, understandable, and easily imagined. Yet the miscommunication theory leaves a troubling gap. If it were a simple mistake, why did the pattern repeat?
Why did multiple calls fail in similar ways, leaving the same void at critical moments? Why did staff later report the subtle, shared sensation that something was wrong long before they could articulate it? Miscommunication explains part of the anomaly, but not its consistency, not its timing, not the quiet weight of helplessness that pervaded the office. Another theory points to operator absence or distraction. Perhaps someone stepped away for a moment, left a line unmonitored, or became momentarily overwhelmed. It is plausible. Humans are fallible, and attention drifts. Clerks and operators all later admitted brief lapses, hesitations, moments where focus faltered. Still, this theory too is incomplete. It does not account for the calls that were answered and then abruptly silenced. It does not explain why logs showed blank spaces where entries should have been, nor why multiple staff members experienced simultaneous uncertainty. Absence or distraction could create individual mistakes, but the phenomenon in this case extended beyond a single person's brief lapse. Technical failure is another avenue to consider. Lines may have gone dead, switchboards may have malfunctioned, wires could have carried static or lost connection. Equipment wears out, as it always does. And yet the technical theory falls short as well. Investigations afterward showed no mechanical faults capable of producing the precise sequence of silence, partial reconnection, and abrupt disappearance of the caller's voice. The phones continued to work normally in subsequent hours and days. The equipment alone cannot account for the subtle, almost imperceptible anomalies that staff later recalled: the faint hesitation in the hum of electricity, the way paper seemed to shift when no one touched it, the timing of footsteps echoing oddly in corridors. There are other, quieter possibilities. Perhaps chance played a role, an improbable alignment of small errors and coincidences that compounded into a critical failure. But chance offers little comfort. It cannot explain the emotional resonance, the anxiety and uncertainty that settled over the office, nor the way individuals carried the moment with them long after it passed. Chance feels insufficient when the weight of human expectation is considered. And then, of course, there is the unknown. What we cannot explain may simply elude understanding. The file itself preserves fragments, smudged ink, incomplete logs, handwritten annotations, and recollections that conflict in minor but meaningful ways. These gaps resist closure. They invite speculation, reflection, and a quiet, lingering unease. The unanswered questions are perhaps the most telling. Why did the line go silent just as the caller needed guidance most? Why did multiple staff members perceive the same subtle anomalies, the same shared hesitations, even when separated by distance and task? Why does the record preserve inconsistencies rather than clarity? The emotional dimension is as real as the procedural one. Staff reported a sense of weight, a subtle oppression in the room as moments passed without resolution. Hands trembled while lifting receivers, breaths became shallow, measured. Heartbeats quickened in the quiet, as though the body itself registered the absence before the mind could fully comprehend it. This is a dimension not captured in logs or technical reports, but it is preserved in testimony, in memory, and in the lingering presence of the file itself. Time in the office moved differently on that day. Seconds stretched, not with urgency, but with anticipatory tension. The pause between a ring and the voice that failed to arrive carried more weight than the ring itself. Each moment allowed anxiety to accumulate, quietly, almost politely, but persistently. Even now, decades later, the file conveys this emotional texture. The hum of fluorescent lights, the faint shuffling of papers, the tick of a distant clock. These are the enduring echoes. They remind us that failure is not always catastrophic in the conventional sense. Sometimes it is small, intimate, internal. Sometimes it is a series of absences and hesitations that leave human beings carrying the memory of what they could not answer, could not prevent, could not change. Every theory, then, must contend with this, the human cost. Miscommunication explains actions, perhaps, but not the anxiety. Operator absence accounts for lapses, but not the shared sense of tension. Technical failure outlines possibilities, but not the weight carried in each heartbeat, each careful breath. Chance can produce unlikely sequences, but not the emotional resonance that follows them through time. And the unknown remains, inevitable, unresolved, persistent. In reflecting on the event, one cannot escape a profound awareness of uncertainty. The file does not resolve it, and perhaps it was never meant to. Instead, it preserves the questions, the unanswered calls, the empty lines, the fleeting, fragmented voice that sought help, the hands that trembled over receivers, the silence that stretched, expansive and oppressive. And perhaps that is the lesson that endures, that some events resist closure, not because the record is incomplete, nor because people failed in their duties, but because human experience itself is fragile, fragile in the face of circumstance, chance, and the limits of perception. The ordinary, no matter how well structured, carries within it the possibility of absence, and when that absence arrives, the effect is more emotional than procedural, more tragic than technical, more intimate than observable. Theories offer comfort, structure, and explanation. They give a framework to understand what occurred, and yet they cannot replace the moments themselves, the moments of uncertainty, of hesitation, of helplessness, the moments where someone reached out and was met not with response, but with silence. In that silence, the file finds its permanence, not in answers, not in resolutions, but in the quiet, lasting weight of what was left undone. The unanswered call becomes a symbol, not of technical failure alone, but of human vulnerability. The file preserves it, methodically, meticulously, yet without remedy. The questions linger. Always they linger. Could more have been done? Should someone have acted faster, noticed sooner, responded differently? Was it miscommunication, distraction, technical error, or an unlikely combination of small failures? Or is it simply an event beyond comprehension, a moment where human expectation met the limits of circumstance? No theory can claim certainty. No explanation can fully account for the absence. And perhaps the most unsettling truth is that some mysteries are meant to remain unresolved, their weight carried quietly by those who encountered them and by those who revisit the records years later. The office is silent now. The phones are still. Paper rests in neat stacks. The city hums faintly beyond the walls, indifferent to what occurred within. A clock ticks. The hum of electricity continues. Footsteps echo occasionally, distant and measured. The ordinary persists. Yet the file remains, preserved, sealed, annotated, and revisited. Each reading brings with it the same quiet reflection, the same subtle dread, the same understanding that human error, chance, and circumstance can intersect in ways that leave permanent emotional traces. And the unanswered questions persist indefinitely. What truly went wrong? We do not know. We may never know. And perhaps that is exactly how it should be recorded, not with certainty, but with attention, not with resolution, but with remembrance, not with closure, but with the quiet acknowledgement that sometimes the ordinary can falter, leaving those involved with nothing but questions, memories, and the weight of unspoken, unresolved moments.
The office never felt quite the same. Even after the phones stopped ringing in that irregular, disquieting pattern, a subtle weight lingered in the air. The fluorescent lights hummed as they always had, but their sound seemed sharper now, more insistent. Paper shifted faintly under idle fingers. Chairs scraped softly against the floor. Every ordinary motion carried a quiet consciousness, a sense of attention stretched thin. Some staff returned, some did not. Those who remained spoke in hushed tones, careful not to dwell, careful not to disturb the fragile routine that had been restored. But restoration was only superficial. The shared experience of helplessness, of a moment lost and unrectified, left an imprint. It shaped gestures, posture, and even the pace of work. Typists pressed keys a fraction slower. Operators lifted receivers with a more deliberate motion, as if the act itself had become fragile, weighty. Families of the caller learned only fragments. A voice on the line had reached them, but not fully. A plea remained incomplete. No immediate danger could be confirmed. No resolution arrived. They were left with uncertainty, a quiet anxiety that persisted long after the day ended. They asked questions. They received logs. They received procedural explanations. But these were documents of process, not of experience. They could not convey the tremor in the operator's hands, the pause that had lasted seconds but felt like hours, or the sudden, inexplicable stillness that filled the office at the precise moment help could not reach the other side of the line. For the operators and staff, the weight of the event transformed into vigilance, not the kind imposed by policy, but the kind that emerges from memory and regret. Every call, every ring, every moment of silence was now measured against the day when something ordinary faltered. Their perception of routine changed. Steps became more deliberate. Eyes lingered longer on screens. Pens were lifted and set down with a quiet consciousness of fragility. The office itself adapted, subtly. Procedures were adjusted, checklists were expanded, double confirmations were introduced. Nothing could fully repair what had occurred, but the structures provided the illusion of certainty. And perhaps, for some, that was enough to carry on. For others, it was not. The memory remained, vivid in fragments, the hiss of static, the abrupt silence, the faint mechanical hum that seemed to echo a breath that was never returned. Outside the office, the city moved as it always had. Traffic flowed over wet asphalt, voices drifted through corridors and streets. The world carried on, unaware of the subtle fracture that had occurred within a single building. And yet, for those present, that day remained a quiet marker, a line in memory separating before from after. Weeks passed, months. The event became a reference in staff meetings, mentioned quietly, almost in passing. Manuals were annotated, protocols were revised, yet no update could capture the emotional texture of what had occurred. No policy could replicate the subtle tension, the heightened awareness, the quiet dread that had suffused the office for hours. Families adapted as best they could. They carried uncertainty with them, filling it with speculation, tentative narratives, and lingering questions. Did someone act differently than they should have? Was there an unnoticed opportunity to prevent the outcome? Their reflections were private, internal, and heavy. The absence of answers became a companion, a quiet echo in their homes, in their routines, in the long stretches of evening when silence was unbroken. Among the staff, informal traditions emerged, small, deliberate acts intended to preserve attention, to safeguard against oversight, to honor the moment when human expectation met its limits. A pen placed in a particular way, a log double-checked, a silent glance shared with a colleague before lifting a receiver. Each gesture carried the memory of helplessness. And the file itself remained. Yellowed pages with frayed edges, handwritten annotations smudged by hurried hands, tape still in place, securing sheets that were missing, torn, or displaced. Each detail, preserved with meticulous care, conveyed not only the record of events, but the lingering weight of experience. To open the file was to feel the quiet melancholy, to hear the absent calls in the mind, to sense the human responses carried in each notation. Audits and investigations reviewed the log sheets. Technical systems were examined.
Lines were tested, rewired, replaced. All was found functional, operational, within expected parameters. Yet no review could reconcile what was lost in those critical minutes. The voice that reached out, the hands that lifted a receiver too late, the heartbeat that sped in response to absence, the shared, intangible dread that rippled across the office. Visitors to the office years later remarked on the quiet, not the kind of silence imposed by emptiness, but a silence born of memory. Even when staff moved through their work, the air seemed heavier. Footsteps fell differently. The shuffle of paper carried meaning. Phones that once rang in predictable cadence now reminded those present of a day when nothing was certain and human effort had been insufficient. The families who called, who waited for resolution, carried their own traces. Conversations with authorities, polite explanations, fragments of logs, all were imperfect. Every recollection contained a shadow of uncertainty. Every memory, a quiet ache. The mundane tasks of daily life, laundry, groceries, commuting, became subtly marked by the awareness that a moment had passed without response. A chance had been lost, and the consequences, though unseen, were emotionally tangible. The office continued to function, but the experience left its mark. Staff learned vigilance, yes, but also carried regret. Attention could mitigate risk, but could not restore what was absent. They understood, quietly, that some moments are irrecoverable, some mistakes are uncorrectable, and some calls, no matter how earnest, may never be answered in time. And so the file closed, as all files do, but softly, without ceremony. Pages pressed together with care, tapes securing the contents remained in place, notes left behind, smudged with the fingerprints of those who had handled them in urgency, remained as silent witnesses. The edges of the pages frayed, curling slightly with age and handling. No triumphant conclusion awaited in these margins. No resolution could be found. Only memory, carefully cataloged, preserved, and revisited. To engage with the file is to engage with absence, the silence that fills the office long after the phones cease to ring, the soft rustle of papers moved by invisible hands, the distant city hum fading as evening descends, the faint echo of steps across empty floors. These are the markers left behind, subtle and almost imperceptible, yet heavy with meaning. The quiet ending is not dramatic. There is no closure. There is no sense of justice completed, no relief in resolution. The day's events recede into memory, but their emotional residue remains. Operators, clerks, typists, families, all carry fragments, impressions, and the knowledge that some things cannot be retrieved. Some calls go unanswered. Some moments slip beyond recovery. And yet, in the careful preservation of the file, in the methodical recording of anomalies, in the notes left behind, there is a measure of respect, not for resolution, not for closure, but for remembrance. The humans involved, their attention, their efforts, their vulnerabilities are memorialized. The file holds the quiet truth that sometimes the ordinary falters, that helplessness is real, and that absence can be as potent as presence. The office doors close at the end of each day. Lights are switched off, footsteps fade. The hum of electricity softens. Outside, traffic continues, voices carry along streets, life unfolds in ordinary rhythm. Inside, the file remains. Its pages yellowed, its tapes secure, its annotations preserved. And if one listens carefully, attentively, quietly, the faint echo of unanswered calls, of trembling hands, of breath held too long, may still be perceived. The record is not sensational, it is not horrifying, it is human, it is tragic in its subtlety. It speaks not of dramatic events, but of ordinary lives touched by failure, absence, and the weight of uncertainty. And so the file closes, as all files do, gently, not with finality, not with triumph, not with resolution, but with quiet remembrance. The edges frayed, the tape in place, the notes left behind,
and the unanswered questions lingering softly in the still air.